Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Asian Confluence, I, Marshalin Matthew, welcome our distinguished moderator, our eminent speakers, and all the participants joining us today for the webinar, Politics of Natural Disasters and Environmental Governance, Perspectives from ASEAN and India. Thank you all for taking the time to be a part of this important conversation. This webinar will explore how climate change, governance, and social inequality and regional cooperation shape disaster preparedness, response, and resilience across ASEAN and India. So today, for this engaging session, we have with us Dr. Serena Rahman, lecturer in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and associate fellow at the ISEAS Yusuf Ishaq Institute. Also joining us today, we have Dr. Anamika Barua, who is a professor in economics in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Guwahati. Also with us today, who will be joining us later, is Dr. Anil Kumar Gupta, professor in the Department of Water Resources, Development and Management at IIT Roorkee. To moderate today's session, we have with us Dr. Dhanasri Jayaram, Senior Assistant Professor in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at the Manipal Institute of Social Sciences, Humanities and Arts, and coordinator of the Center for Climate Studies at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Dr. Anil Kumar Gupta, ma'am, is on the flight right now and might not be able to join us immediately. He will be joining us later, and we will be giving you a cue on that. So we welcome you all, and we are all very grateful you all took the time out of your lives to be a part of us today for this important conversation. A pointer for the audience before we begin. So the questions may be posted in the chat box at any time, and the moderator may take them up during the question and answer session, subject to the available time. We also request everyone to keep their questions concise and relevant to the theme of the webinar. Without keeping you waiting, may I now hand over the session to Dr. Dhanasri Jayaram, who will guide the conversation and invite our speakers to share their perspectives. Dr. Jayaram, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to chair the session on natural disasters, as you mentioned. And this particular session would particularly focus on the politics of natural disasters and environmental governance, looking at both ASEAN and India. So I mean, so as we know, this is a topic that becomes extremely relevant in today's context, considering how much disasters, whether in Southeast Asia or India, are not just understood as simply something that is natural or something that is geophysical, but as outcomes that are shaped by environmental politics, governance structures, social inequalities, climate change, and many other factors that need to be considered while we look at the kind of disasters that this particular region is experiencing. And of course, we know that there are more frequent and intense hazards, which include floods or cyclones, typhoons, droughts, landslides, which also raise questions about resilience, sustainability, disaster governance, and so on. Now, over the years, ASEAN, India, countries within Southeast Asia have developed various institutional mechanisms. So while India has strengthened also cooperation with ASEAN and many countries within ASEAN, especially with a series of disaster management initiatives, capacity building initiatives, technical exchanges, humanitarian assistance efforts. However, we also know that challenges remain in translating some of these commitments into effective, locally responsive action on the ground. Now, what this webinar will particularly focus on, and thank you to Asian Confluence for inviting such eminent experts who have been working in the areas of disasters, water management, and many other issues that concern disaster risk reduction and resilience perspectives, particularly from a critical perspective. And I think that has become very important to address in today's context. So first is, of course, a climate and political ecology perspective, because we need to understand vulnerability, exposure, in terms of how environmental governance shapes these patterns in itself. I think the second important question that we need to also address is how the historical social perspective explores, how disasters both reflect and reinforce existing inequalities while also creating opportunities for social and political transformation. And one of the key questions that will also be addressed, and hopefully this is something that Dr. Anil Gupta also works on, particularly in terms of preparedness, institutional capacity, risk informed planning, knowledge management, climate resilient infrastructure. Now these are some of the things that all the countries in this region are focusing on, and we need to also look at how this will be done. So these are some of the key questions that hopefully will be answered by this by the speakers and by the experts who have joined us. Maybe what I will do is first I will request both the speakers, Serena and Anamika, maybe to reflect on some of these questions first for a few minutes, and then we will go on to question and answers. And I see that there are also a lot of questions from the audience that we will try to take up later on, and hopefully Dr. Anil Gupta will join, and then we can also take up some of these questions with him. So Dr. Serena, maybe we can start with you. Yeah, over to you.
Right. Well, I think it's morning on your side. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and thank you for inviting me. Um, I think the questions that were asked are very broad. I work, as you can see in the background, in Malaysia with artisanal fishermen. And to be honest, where we are, because we are in the Tabrau Strait, just between Malaysia and Singapore, it is a little bit protected. Across Southeast Asia, there are fishermen, farmers on the front lines of climate change impacts and natural disasters, which are more exposed to the dangers. We have, as you mentioned, groups that are dealing with HADR at the ASEAN level, and coming up with policy, sharing information, but a lot of that is very top down. On the ground, really, what happens when there is a disaster, as you can often see in the Philippines, in Malaysia, we have floods as a result of storm and typhoon every year. But the people who are on the ground immediately are often NGOs and civil society organizations. I think in the Philippines, most as a, this is the key example that we see is that people have to mobilize themselves when aid is difficult or they are so inaccessible, and the country is so large that it is difficult to get to. If you look at what happened recently, I think last year in Aceh, again, it is right at the end of Sumatra. They struggled to have assistance come to them. And then there were governmental issues. For example, when international aid wanted to come in, they were blocked. And so things like this also make it difficult. So there you have in itself many examples of how government policy, government difficulties, perhaps shortcomings, the size of the country, really, Malaysia is quite small compared to the rest. Accessibility when it comes to meeting people who are in disaster situations. And then also whether we're talking about rural disasters where people don't even know that something has happened, or whether it's in a city where there's higher impact because it is so dense, but then, all the aid assistance and the center of governance is there, so it's more visible. These are the issues that perhaps have to be taken into account if we talk about natural disasters. So I guess I'll leave it at there, because there will be questions later, I understand. So perhaps that's just the context for Southeast Asia, and I turn it back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Serena, for that initial remarks, and some of these issues that you've highlighted. Of course, we will maybe go a little deeper into these questions of institutional capacity, inequalities, and the politics of it all, and when it comes to the governance itself. Dr. Anamika, if I can come to you now with your initial remarks on this theme.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dhanashree. And it was very nice to hear also what Dr. Sanina mentioned. I mostly work on the transboundary rivers. So I would like to actually mostly talk about disaster, which crosses borders, So like you very rightly mentioned in the very beginning, is that disasters, when we actually now speak about natural disaster, we often think of floods, cyclones, droughts, landslides, all of these as if they are acts of nature. But after working for so many years, particularly on the Brahmaputra River basin, I have come to realize that disasters are rarely just natural events. Right? They are also so much political. So a flood may begin with heavy rainfall, but whether it becomes a disaster depends on decisions we make, like where we build our cities, how we manage our rivers, whether we conserve our wetlands, who has access to early warning systems, and ultimately whose risks matters. So climate change actually is making these questions even more urgent. Across both India and ASEAN, we are witnessing more frequent floods, longer drought, sea level rise, so many such uncertainty, particularly due to the kind of changes that we are seeing today. At the same time, these regions share some of the world's most important transboundary river basins. The Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Mekong, Salween, where water, ecosystems, and people are connected across national borders. And this is where politics actually becomes central. From where I come in Assam, on the banks of the Brahmaputra, floods are almost an annual reality. Even when I'm speaking to you here, it is the whole of Assam is almost flooded. Yet many of these floods are not actually created in Assam. Their causes may lie hundreds of kilometers upstream through intense rainfall, changing glacier dynamics, sediment movements, or the operation of hydraulic infrastructure. So this also illustrates a very powerful reality that disasters may be experienced locally, but they are often generated regionally. That means no state, and indeed, I mean, to some extent, even no country can effectively manage disaster risk on its own. You may have the best disaster management policy, the most efficient emergency response system, and the strongest institutions within your own borders. But if information from upstream is delayed, if hydrological data are not shared, or if countries do not trust one another, those national efforts will always, kind of remain incomplete. So this is why transboundary disaster management, disaster governance is fundamentally, it's different from domestic disaster management. However, cooperation itself is not a very, it's not a technical experience. It itself is deeply uh, political. In every transboundary river basin, there are asymmetries of power. Some countries are upstream while others are downstream. Some control major dams, critical infrastructure. Some have greater scientific and financial capacity. So all of these basically depends how we are going to bring countries together. How do we negotiate? How are we going to ensure that disasters, transboundary disasters in particular, becomes more manageable? And which is something that we can discuss a bit more later, is that climate change actually now presents us with an important opportunity. The interconnected nature of climate risk means that water security can no longer be separated from food security, energy security, and also from regional stability. And countries increasingly have shared interest in reducing disaster losses, protecting ecosystems, and also strengthening resilience. So I would like to conclude my initial thought with one thing that I've been thinking a lot the last couple of years when I'm working on these river basins, is that today the greatest challenge in transboundary river basin is not that river cross political boundaries. That is what I mean. The real challenge, what it looks like, is whether our politics are can cross those rivers as well. And particularly in an era of climate change, resilience will depend not on how well we govern our own side of the river, but on how well we govern the river we actually share. So I'm going to stop here, Anushree.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that really lays the foundation for like some of the key questions that we will discuss later, particularly when it comes to transboundary nature of disasters and how does cooperation work in this arena of disaster risk reduction and disaster management. So, Dr. Serena, if I can come back to you now, some of the things that you already sort of highlighted in your initial remarks. I think what Dr. Anamika also mentioned, we tend to call disasters as natural, or natural disasters as something that we commonly use as a terminology, something as if we portray them as external shocks. But as you mentioned, your work especially sort of looks at vulnerability that is shaped by long-standing political, economic, environmental processes, social processes, and these are not entirely natural, right? So these are these. There are so many I mean, there's so many factors that play as a big factor in sort of driving these risks and exacerbating these risks. So, in the context of Southeast Asia, if you can tell us a little bit more about how do development choices, environmental degradation, governance structures, political systems, now how do these different factors, have a bearing on the climate-related disasters, and how like governments and other stakeholders respond to disasters?
Thanks very much for that question. I think it's very important. To be honest, climate change, which is relatively recent, if you think about how things have been run over the years, is the final straw, right? So there have been generations of inequality, of governmental issues, of social injustice that have existed. Who has absolute power, and who makes decisions, for example, for coastal development, for displacement of local people, of moving people to more dangerous areas so that development or land can be acquired for ports or luxury housing. Who decides on doing things like reclamation and dredging, which then puts local communities that depend on natural habitats in greater danger or in more difficulty or in deeper poverty, which then is exacerbated by climate change impacts. This occurs all over Southeast Asia. Artisanal fishermen and farmers are the backbone of rural communities. Ironically, they also supply food to those in the urban areas where these decisions are made, but they're often overlooked and they're often in the bottom 40 economically. And so they are the ones not only on the front lines of climate change, facing extreme weather, rising sea levels, sudden changes in temperature, and all of this impacts where fish moves. It impacts whether the crops can grow or survive. It can be harvested. But at the same time, they are already struggling. They struggle even more as a result of their inability to harvest or catch fish. And then they slide even further into inequality. So while urban centers are where decisions are made that affect them, they are relatively sheltered from the impacts of climate change. I mean, that's where they all have electricity, water, air conditioning, and can live in comfort as they make decisions. But again, they are not rooted in these coastal rural areas, and their decisions often do not reflect local knowledge. They don't have local input. They're very detached from local understandings of change. You have scientists claiming to know best what is the way forward, but their information perhaps is not strengthened by input from local communities because local knowledge is looked down upon. All of these things. Historically, we have social structures, hierarchies that put these fishermen and farmers, like a feudal society, right at the bottom of the pyramid. And so their knowledge is deemed inferior and not considered equal to or worthy of consultation. And so policies and decisions are made without understanding the realities on the ground and how severe impacts actually are. I have met with scientists who told me, oh no, we've done the modeling and your area doesn't have sea level rise. And I'm like, are you serious? Because I have photographic evidence of how the water comes up every time it rains and every year when the tides come up, where it's getting higher and higher up my leg. And I've asked them, have you ever gone down to the ground to ground truth your models? And they're like, oh, not to your area, but we know it doesn't occur there. So this is the kind of elitism and a total disconnectedness that is held by scientists who provide input into policy, and that then becomes dangerous. And the thing is, when you put these communities in danger, it's not just a human rights issue. It's not just a social justice issue. Eventually, it'll come back to those in the city because you are jeopardizing your food security. If you don't take into account issues such as this, availability of seafood, of crops, farmers who are dealing with how to take care of their livestock. And, we've had issues of floods in Southeast Asia, which then endangered livestock, which drowned chicken and goats and cows. If all of this is not taken into account, then the whole country is going to suffer when it comes to food security. Not everybody can afford to import food. And countries as a whole perhaps don't have the means. Bigger countries, poorer developing countries in Southeast Asia, don't have the ability to mobilize so quickly as perhaps Singapore did when it was faced with COVID issues and didn't have import access, right? So the rest of us in Southeast Asia struggle. That is on top of other issues in terms of lack of transparency, governance, this whole system of perhaps cronyism, the way we function as a region perhaps does not always work best for the poorer people on the front lines of climate change. But again, there's so much that is institutional, that is systemic, and the things that have come forward so that are not so negative to solve these issues really are the NGOs and the civil society organizations, which have always been filling in the gaps, which form sort of a bridge between governance, between policy and realities on the ground. And they are filling the gaps by providing assistance, by opening doors for local communities, by working to empower them and giving them a voice. But they also, of course, face lots of structural and institutional obstacles that they have to overcome. We are also in a transboundary area. I really appreciated what you were saying. And so any development on either side of our Tabrao Strait has an impact on the artisanal fishermen that depend on this very narrow waterway. I think our waters in an international strait is far narrower than some of the rivers that you are very familiar with. And so we face the same issues. Once you have rampant coastal development that affects natural habitats, which are the backbone of community livelihoods, there will be impact. How do you work together? As you said, trust is an issue always. To see this space as a common shared good, that we can't just take possession of and say, oh, this part of the water is ours and that's yours, and what you build there doesn't affect us, because it inevitably will. So yes, we do need to overcome these trust issues, find ways where countries can work together. Southeast Asia as a region is quite small, even though we feel it's very vast. And we are all interconnected in so many ways through our rivers and seas. How do we overcome that? We have ASEAN, but it is a big, slow, bureaucratic monster. How do we help each other in spite of these big structures that sort of get in the way of immediate aid when it's needed? I think we can pass it on.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I think, yeah, like, you sort of touch upon so many important issues and, yeah, many factors that act as intermediate factors, which need to be considered when we are designing governance structures, particularly in this age of polycrisis or systemic crisis. The way crises are developing right now, it's more complex, and there's more uncertainty, and there's more, like, changes that we are seeing around us, and many a time we don't reflect on many changes, like the landscape, how it's evolving, or how demography is evolving, and so many different factors that need to be considered. I'll come back to you on some of the issues, particularly what you referred to in terms of the coastal communities. I think that's very critical in this region, and gets, again, doesn't get reflected so much in the transboundary regional sort of cooperation that we are talking about. Dr. Anamika, you mentioned you work particularly in the area of water, and water is at the center of climate security, disaster risk reduction, disaster management, particularly when it comes to transboundary river basins. Um, Again, this is an area that is not so developed in this part of the region, although we have agreements and all of that in place. Yet we don't see much of this transboundary cooperation that is much needed, like joint management of say watershed, or many other things that doesn't get much of traction. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more, looking at both South and Southeast Asia, what are the opportunities that you see for strengthening regional cooperation on water governance? Do you see, like, if you could build on the existing mechanisms, or do you need like new ones? And how will this really contribute to broader disaster resilience, climate adaptation efforts? And I think this is also a critical question, considering these elements are still treated very much in silo, right? So disaster, climate adaptation, many of the water management, these are all considered the siloed sort of, frameworks of governance. I wonder, like, how will regional cooperation or transboundary cooperation work from that point?
Hmm. Thank you for that question. Like I mentioned, so far, of course, regional cooperation has always been a very, very important point that countries are talking about, or countries needs to come together and talk about. But somehow, after in the recent past, what we see is that due to climate change, disasters are not confined to any one country. In 2024, if you remember, something that happened in the northeast of India actually had a huge impact in Bangladesh. So, it is very, very clear that, given the kind of the nature of, and the particularly nature of uncertainty that climate change brings, and as very rightly mentioned, that, it actually exaggerates the existing inequality, the existing vulnerability. So it actually, in a way, it is important that when countries sit for negotiating or sit for a dialogue, climate change also has to be kept in mind, given that we do not know what the future would be. So given that, I feel that, one of the greatest opportunities lies at now is strengthening this regional cooperation, at least through information sharing. And this is not simply about exchanging data, which is something that we always see, that we always talk about, sharing raw data between countries. It is happening between China, India, it is happening between India and Bangladesh. But it is also about agreeing on what information should be shared, ensuring that this information that is shared is timely and reliable. And so I do distinguish between information and data, because data is something like, it is raw data. So much xx of rainfall happening per hour, xs of amount of water would go up. But information is more about, this is happening, you need to ask community living in this area to evacuate. It goes beyond just sharing the data, at what rate it is going to go up, after how many hours you will see the impact. This is what is still missing, particularly in the South Asian River Basin, whereas you do see in Mekong, given that they have a Mekong River Commission, that they do have a kind of a joint monitoring system. But we do not really have it in South Asia. So one thing that is there in today's context is that there's a lot that we can also learn from each other from across the river basin. And I also believe that this is also about building shared resilience, because countries also have common interests in reducing disaster losses. Every country wants to strengthen food and energy security, protect and safeguard, for example, livelihood. These shared objectives can actually become a powerful incentive for cooperation. Ultimately, what I think is that effective transboundary water governance is not just about, sharing water. It is also about sharing knowledge, risk, responsibilities, and also solutions. Unfortunately, if you really look at the South Asian River Basin today, we do not really have a mechanism, like many other river basin has. Very interestingly, even river basins such as Nile, which has a lot of conflict and contestation, sharing of regular data, 12 months a year exists. But if you look at South Asian River Basin, we still do not really have it. And I think these are very, very important things that we need to bring up to the negotiation table. Countries needs to have more dialogue. And I would also distinguish between negotiation and dialogue. Negotiation is something like somebody will win, somebody will lose. But at least we need to have continuous dialogue between countries who share these transboundary rivers, who has transboundary nature of disasters. It is important that you keep talking to each other and identify where the problem is. Can we think of monitoring the river jointly? To give you a very quick example, what happens is that when one country sends data, raw data to the other country takes a lot of time to convert that raw data into an early warning. But imagine if the country of that river basin have generated the early warning together, it saves everybody's time. You are not sharing only the data, you are also sharing the warning. So warning also moves across the river. So I think those are the things which are extremely important. Because as Anina mentioned, all of these issues related to, where flooding is happening, the issue of justice, these are also various. Now today there are various new areas, new pockets where earlier community has not seen flooding. Today, they do see floods. They are not even prepared for those kind of flooding, given that we have always focused on historically those areas where flood has been very, very prominent. There is also one very important point to remember here. Today, we see dual nature of risk, meaning the area which is flooded during the time of rainfall also sees heavy drought when it is not raining. So you need to also prepare, you also need to have a disaster plan for how to handle drought, again, in transboundary rivers. All of these would become easier if we have information, data, exchanges, risks information, particularly much in advance to prepare well and to make our community much more resilient to these changes. One last point before I hand it over to you. Whenever we talk about transboundary waters, somehow there is this feeling that it is happening at a macro scale. But what we tend to forget is that macro level decision making, whether we will share data, when we will share data, what kind of data would be shared, how information will travel across regions, has a huge impact at the micro level. At the end of the day, why do we need these information and warnings? Because we want to make our community well prepared before the disaster hits. In fact, we should not let the hazard convert into a disaster. So that is something I think is very important, and I think there's a lot that needs to be done in that area of managing these kind of transboundary disasters.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Anamika. Just to sort of build on that from a Southeast Asian perspective, Dr. Serena, I think what she mentioned towards the end about the macro level policies and how that affects the micro level. I think this is one of the questions which I also wanted to ask you, because governments, they tend to do they tend to move beyond these top down approaches, and how can they do it, meaningfully integrate different communities? In your case, in your research, you have looked at coastal and fishing communities particularly. So how do you integrate them meaningfully into disaster preparedness, adaptation, recovery? And do the top down sort of approaches, do they actually reflect the needs and the requirements, and reflect the realities of the ground? I think you talked about this in the beginning, that sometimes the policies don't really reflect what's going on. Sometimes the models or the scientific sort of data, whatever is there, does not reflect the realities of the population that is most affected by climate change, or the impacts of disasters. So how do you make sure the top down and the bottom up, there's a bridging between the two, and how do these gaps really get filled?
Right. Thanks for the question. I think it's very important, but it's it's very difficult to overcome. So we have Southeast Asia as a region, we have ASEAN. So you're asking about gaps and bridges. So I think for us, the bridges need to exist on many levels. So we have at the ASEAN level, which is up here in the clouds, people making policy, you have ministers speaking to each other, you have track one, track two, track three, all of these big groups talking to each other. And how much of that really comes down to the people? When you have a huge country like the Philippines or Indonesia, which every year is battered, the Philippines more, by earthquakes, typhoons, extreme weathers, and then in some places drought, as you mentioned. And you have so many rural areas. Some people are on mountains, some people are on islands. You have dense urban spaces where people are packed in, living in, unstable infrastructure. How does any of this discussion at the top with the big words and the big taglines and all of this policy, which is literally up in the air and intangible, how does that filter down to the communities? On the most part, it's very slow. And on the most part, many people are just out of reach of the network that barely reaches the ground, to be honest. But the strength in the Philippines, of course, is the community organizations. I have a PhD student, all credit goes to her. Her name is Joanna Hugh. She has been looking at the Philippines as a case study in fisheries communities. And she just graduated yesterday, but she was looking at how slow violence and how essentially social inequalities and infrastructure gets in the way of any kind of response to natural disasters. And really the key to being able to help communities is to identify local champions. In my work here in Malaysia, also, we have noticed that local champions make all of the difference because they are the ones that people will turn to in times of difficulty or in issues. And so what needs to be done, really, the bridging needs to be between ASEAN and our governments, from the governments to the agencies that actually go to the ground, and between the agencies and the communities in terms of finding out who actually mobilizes to get help, who has the networks with the civil society organizations, how do they get access when they're left all alone. Those things actually need to be mapped out so that better aid can go to them. And then we have issues of government changes. So in Southeast Asia, we have governments that stay around forever, but then we also have frequent government change. And when you have government change, sometimes they try to affect civil service changes. And when you have changes in civil service, then you have changes in agencies that should know how to respond regardless of who is in political power. Sometimes that doesn't talk to each other either, which then hampers further change. We have had situations in Malaysia where things were so dire that some politicians, there's one particular politician who got into his kayak to go and rescue people when floodwaters was 3 stories high and they were stuck on the roof. And for him, it wasn't a gimmick. It was just like, the agencies are not coming. I have to do something. And he went out for 8 hours in his kayak to pull children and elderly people down and to get them to safety while they waited for the emergency services to mobilize. And then when you have changes of government, you have changes of budgets. Where does the money go? We need financing to support these groups, whether it's government agencies or whether it's NGOs, to get help to the people. I think we also need to recognize that sometimes we have constraints in cases of agency manpower. So we need to have agencies that are willing to collaborate with civil society organizations, to recognize and acknowledge their shortcomings, and then to reach out so that this network becomes bigger and stronger, to support the NGOs and the community organizations that can work on the ground, to know who they are. Those people will know who the local champions are in each village. Government agencies don't have the time to get to every village. They're supposed to, but they don't. So, you need to build your networks this way. So this is the thing. The top down needs to meet the ground up. And the ground up needs to be able to engage on equal terms. Because a lot of times the top down, as I said earlier, looks down on this. People in elite positions with academic knowledge and PhDs and titles tend to think that they hold the knowledge. So we need to bridge all of that. We need to break the silos. We need to overcome the assumptions and the condescension that exists on the ground often to be able to help people. Because while we talk about policy, while we talk about climate funding and money going here, there, and everywhere, there needs to be immediate work on how to help the people, because climate change is moving at incredible speed. It took a long time to get here, but now it's escalating out of control. We have crazy high temperatures. We have immediate flips of weather. I've gone out in a day to see, and in situations where the wind stays one way for weeks, now it can change 4 times in a day. And you're working out at sea, and if you're a fisherman with a small boat, because artisanal fishermen don't have big boats, heavy nets, and the storm appears without warning, all of the generational knowledge now is flipped. And there's little ways of understanding. They have to start understanding all over again all of these changes which are affecting them directly. So while we are huffing and puffing and talking about policy and laws and trying to find ways to find money to solve things, people are suffering on the ground. So the reaction and the action needs to be taken a lot quicker. So yes, bridging needs to be done, but it needs to be done on many levels. And the movement needs to be a lot faster because climate change is leaving us far behind.
Yeah, thanks for like ending the your intervention on that, as climate change is leaving us far behind, and how far we can adapt. For instance, this is a question, or how much of focus needs to be there on mitigation. And I don't know, these are like questions which wherein finance and other issues become so important because there's so less, for instance, financing that goes into adaptation today. And that brings me to my next question to Dr. Anamika, because you've worked on loss and damage, and this seems to be like one of these most politically charged discussions today as to how does loss and damage finance work, and how do we measure losses and damages, what kind of losses and damages really matter today when we are looking at governance, questions of governance. I think this also, brings to focus questions of migration, displacement, because again, how this is something that we don't address much in South Asia, like particularly climate induced displacement. At the transboundary level is much less discussed. Of course, internally we know the kind of changes that are already happening. Even in Southeast Asia, it's the same story. um, in your research, and in your opinion, or in your view, what policy responses are therefore needed to support affected communities while strengthening resilience in terms of long term resilience, and also looking at the loss and damage, this factor which has become so critical today in the climate discussions, at least.
Yeah. So, actually, I would also like to quickly reflect upon what Sarina mentioned is one of the very interesting thing that we have seen in climate science is whose knowledge counts. It's very interesting that there is so much hierarchy of knowledge itself. Somebody who is running a model, doing a lot of hydrological modeling using AI, ML, and somehow it is considered that those information are much more trustworthy. Those information can give you a better solution than lived experiences of community. That's the very funny thing I always see. People would say, okay, fine, community told you XYZ, but does our model speak about it? So the thing is, somebody who lives with flood, somebody who is seeing losses and damage is not trusted, but somebody who has never visited those study sites and have run sophisticated models are trusted more. So it is not that we should not have sophisticated models, sophisticated science. We definitely need that. But like as you mentioned, Serena, that it needs to meet the ground reality, because today the kind of losses and damage that we see on the ground, and today it's no longer that something is going to happen. It's a reality. It's already happening. And given that, how do you bring these two kind of science together? And I would say the community has so much knowledge and information because they have been living with these kind of challenges, decades and decades. It's actually a science too, but we fail to consider it, that their knowledge also brings a kind of science from the ground. Now, coming to your question, I think, yes, migration and displacement that we see today is no longer, it's not that something people are migrating because they feel that there are better opportunities. They are migrating because of the losses of land due to erosion, due to frequent flood, due to drought. They are now looking for sectors where the income that they get is coming from, or remittances that we say, it comes from non-climate sensitive sectors. But unfortunately, in South Asia and also in Southeast Asia, what I see is that while we do talk about losses and damage, but connecting losses and damage to climate change has remained a big challenge. And unless we do that, to get fundings, particularly to make it something that we need it because of climate change, because you have to connect losses and damage happening from climate change and losses and damage happening because of your poor urbanization, etc., is very different. So that methodology is still not very well developed, unfortunately. We still do not have one kind of a cross-cutting framework to assess losses and damage. And this is important because today, if say, for example, state of Assam is asking for losses and damage fund, and if suppose a city in Myanmar is also asking same, whom should the funding organization provide the fund? Because we do not really have a common type of framework to assess who needs it most. So their biggest problem is that the research and loss and damage is still not up there. We still are struggling with and we still feel that it is still a distant reality, but it is already happening. And we have to very clearly remember that adaptation and impact of losses and damage, the impact of losses and damage is so quick that adaptation cannot take care of it. It takes a bit of a time for people to adapt, to build their resilience to the changes that is happening. So how do you ensure that the people survive? So one of the things that you see across is migration. And migration to me is, although it is a lot looked up as an adaptation strategy, but my own work, people, talking to people, migrant workers, seems that it is not really can be considered as an adaptation strategy. It is more like a coping strategy. There are a lot of losses there too, emotional loss, cultural loss. You lose your family network. You live in a very, very different, place where you are not even familiar to the culture. You don't even eat that food. You don't even speak that language, right? So there's a lot of emotional and psychological stress that both the migrant worker and people who are left behind in the home goes through. So if you ask me about policies, I think we don't really have a very strong policy of how do you support these families? How do we ensure that the migration process, if first of all, you need to provide opportunities where they are, if it is a push migration and not a pull migration. And if you're not able to do that, then you need to make sure that this whole process of migration becomes smoother. It should not be that it puts further stress. We don't even have, at least I'm talking about of my own state, we don't even have data of how many people migrate every year from these flood and drought affected areas. Unless we don't have this information, which household migrates, why do they migrate, where do they migrate? Maybe the state government needs to have very good strategy with states or policies in the other state where these migrant workers are going to. How will they be protected in those areas? So I think there's a lot to be done when you really ask me from the point of view of loss and damage, which is more at international level. There are a lot of assessment needs. There are a lot of framework that needs to come up. A lot of discussions needed, and at the ground level too. Before those comes in, because that is going to take time. How do you support these climate-induced migration and climate-induced displacement? I think we are still not there. I mean, we still, and in fact, we very very comfortably say that migration is an adaptation strategy, but it is not really if you look at who migrates and in what conditions do they migrate.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I think my video is just acting a bit weird, but I'll just continue without the video if that's okay. Yeah, so and I think that that's an important point to consider, like how we frame issues, right? So migration as an adaptation strategy versus like how migration has become a reality for so many communities. Where it's not about like a choice based migration. It's more like forcible displacement and forced displacement and so many things that go with it. If So I know that we have like around 12 minutes left now in this webinar, and Dr. Anil Gupta, I'm not sure if he's able to join us. I'll just take up some of the questions from the audience now, if that's okay. Dr. Serena, this is a question I think which I think you will be able to take up, particularly relating to this whole question of balancing between economic growth and sustainability. This is something that has I see that a lot of questions which were also posed in the I think the registration form also talk about this particular issue. I'm if you can maybe link it to like how we are talking about today, like promoting the blue economy, coastal infrastructure development, and so many things which are sort of critical for economic growth, the story of economic growth. But how does that balance with, say, resilience of marine ecosystems, livelihoods of coastal communities, especially in the face of climate change and more frequent disasters? If you can, maybe reflect on this, whole question of balancing, and what does that mean to really balance? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an important question, but I get all the impossible ones. um, it all boils down to how do you define development, right? And how do you define success? I mean, Bhutan is, of course, the classic example where maybe financial gain is not the the ultimate goal, and happiness is. At least that is what they project, right? If our country's success is always going to be based on economic progress, if the top 1% control everything to decide that everything has to be some capitalistic gain. And they are not interested in preservation for environmental sustainability or community resilience. There's a saying that's going around that to be a billionaire, people have to suffer because there are good billionaires who are giving out their money without any fanfare and helping communities and paying off debts and buying up tracts of land to protect them. But there are also many more who get rich because there are many workers or people who suffer, right? And who earn pittance pay and who have lost their homes, who are displaced in order for that capitalistic success. If we cannot redefine what it means to be developed, if we cannot redefine what it means to be civilized and to have civilization, if we are always chasing the dollar or whatever monetary value we have as the sort of the benchmark of success, then it is very difficult to revise how we think and ensure sustainability because resources are extracted for financial gain. And once we have that mindset that a resource is there, that coastal communities are, dispensable, there is no way for us to balance. We have a lot of good words and good phrases when we have climate change policy, good goals, but can that actually transition into action when there is no political will to move beyond economic gain as the final goal? And I see Dr. Anil is here, so I should stop talking so that he can have a moment. I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I see that Dr. Anil has joined, and thank you so much for joining, although you are in the middle of this travel and everything. Yeah, maybe I'll just give it to give the screen to you so that you can reflect on the key issues concerning like multi-stakeholder engagement, disaster risk reduction, disaster. I mean, you've been working on this for such a long time. I'm sure you have a lot to say. So yeah, over to you, and welcome. Yeah.
So thank you for organizing this wonderful discussion, and I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Is my voice coming? Okay, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And my apology for this challenge. In fact, I am in the flight and flight has not taken off. It was supposed to take off.
Okay. I think we may have lost him. Yeah, I think we have lost him, unfortunately. Maybe, yeah, as soon as he joins, we'll get him back. If we can just continue with the discussion. Dr. Anamika, if I can come to you, I think there are a few questions about regional cooperation, because I think this question about how do we bring different countries, I mean, the region, when we talk about the region, it's also Bangladesh and many other countries that are even, more climate vulnerable, as we are talking about, regional cooperation, transboundary river systems. And this question about how do we have like equal voices for different different stakeholders, different countries within these regional environmental governance mechanisms. And I think one of the questions is also how do we move beyond this sort of emergency response and reactive emergency response, and how do we like have more proactive efforts when it comes to disaster risk reduction? Okay. Okay, Dr. Anil is here. Sorry, we lost you in between. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was using hotspot, so I think I have already exploited all my data. So, but anyway, I'm using my mobile phone directly now, and I'll be very brief so that I will avoid any troubles.
Sure.
If I'm so happy to see Dr. Anamika and other panelists here, and there are a couple of points which I would like to bring, because one is related with the common minimum program, ASEAN uh, the ASEAN nations share so many things. We share so many cultural I would say that aspects, uh, but we share so much in the common challenges also, particularly when it comes to river basins, when it comes to transboundary floods, also in terms of the airshed pollution. And if we just look at the larger ecosystem related challenges, there are also a lot of common challenges that we share. However, what we have been witnessing, that the efforts of having some kind of a common minimum program of sharing information with each other, so that the collaboration has some quantitative basis, and then the technological know-how also. So that is something not yet materialized. In this aspect, what we have been advocating, that the case studies and best practices are one thing. Then the technical and localization prototypes. If we are not able to share the data in complete set, but at least we the countries can, under the ASEAN framework, can decide that to what extent the data where no one has a reservation. So because disaster affects everyone, and the many disasters have, like we say that there are no they do not respect the boundaries. The pollution also do not respect the boundaries. So this is one aspect I would like to bring. Second thing, that the Hindu Kush Himalaya countries, recent initiative I would like to bring in the ASEAN perspective also, that is the HKH DRR Knowledge Hub. I think in the at ASEAN level also, this kind of knowledge hub, where at least the published literature, published case studies, and published data, where no one has any reservation, those can be freely shared among the countries, so that if there are failure stories, people can be beware of and take cautions. And if there are success stories, people can take the advantage of customizing and integrating into their own planning and implementation process. I think that's very important, because this time we are talking of how do we really translate our adaptation intentions, our adaptation larger policy goals into action plans, and then we localize it. Because while we talk the disaster risk reduction and adaptation at global assemblies, and then also at national assemblies, but finally the things will happen at the local level. So this is very important, and for this, the granular level case studies and granular level examples, that what can really work well in particular combination of geographies, is very important. So this is the second point I would like to bring. Third, that the ASEAN countries can work out certain exchange program, which can include the training cooperation, as training collaboration, as well as the research exchange. So at least the tools and techniques which are developed by the some institutions in one country can be transferred, and this kind of cooperation would be very useful. So this is the third point, and I the fourth aspect would be that ASEAN should have on a regular basis the knowledge. I would say that cooperation. So specific sessions on climate resilience and DRR should be organized, because and it is also a need to work jointly to assign economic value. I'm sure that Dr. Anamika is going to talk on this, because whatever we talk in terms of science, it doesn't shake the decision table. But if we are able to assign the economic value, then the decision makers and the policy people give a little bit of ear to that. It is very important, and it is very important, particularly in terms of in reference when we are talking about loss and damage, because globally now there are discussions about the cooperation to address loss and damage, and for that the proper assessment of damages and losses. And in losses, there are a lot of dimensions of non-economic losses, how to assign the monetary value or the economic value to non-economic kind of losses. So these now we are coming up with some good case studies. How do we really scale up, and how do we replicate those kind of studies? And this would be really benefiting in many other terms. So while the cooperation we are talking about DRR and climate actions, but it will have larger sustainability benefits and larger benefits in terms of safeguarding livelihood, safeguarding health. So the local economies as well. So we need to work together to present this picture in a way that people understand that this is not only in narrow interests, but it has larger benefits. So I have only few points at this juncture to share on this forum, and certainly, if possible, I would like to stay here and listen forward to the other speakers as well. Thank you very much,
Yeah,
and over to you for
yeah,
taking this agenda forward. And once again, my apology that I
yeah.
could not join in the time, and I am less structured because I had that plan, but that got disrupted because of these things. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Anil. And yeah, we are almost actually at the close of the webinar, so I'll probably quickly move on to Dr. Anamika, uh,
Yeah,
to whom I had asked a question. Sorry.
yeah, it's a lot of noise.
Yeah. So yeah, I think now it's fine. And Dr.
Yeah.
Anamika, over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. You actually touched upon many of these points, which also I completely agree and emphasize too during my conversation. I would very quickly like to run through the questions that has come on the chat because I think it's important that we respond to the questions. And I found one of the questions, in fact, all the questions very interesting. And I think my response to all of these questions is that it is very important today that we move or we start investing much more on anticipatory governance. Instead of waiting for disasters to occur, what is very important is that we already have a lot of climate projections. We have a lot of hydrological modeling. We also have risk mapping to identify which are those hotspots and guide land use planning, infrastructure investment, adaptation strategy. Unfortunately, disasters are always taken up seriously when it strikes rather than preparing well. Somehow, something that is surprising that it hasn't really moved well yet. And I think second is that disaster governance, particularly in regions like the question has asked, northeastern region, it cannot just stop at the state or national boundaries, like I had mentioned. These are a lot, coming from upstream countries. So what we really need is that as a state too, as a northeastern region too, we must emphasize that we really need to strengthen cooperation on hydrological data sharing, flood forecasting, sediment monitoring, and also, like I mentioned, early warning systems among China, India, Bangladesh, and Bhutan, and also neighboring countries. That is very critical. And I would thirdly, my point goes back to what we have been discussing, that we need to recognize that there is a need to build local communities resilience. Communities should not be simply, consider that, okay, we give them warning and they will respond to that. Do they have the capacity to respond? That is also something is very, very highly need to be discussed. And they should also become, rather than many disaster management plans today say that they are community based. But community based and community led is very, very different because there's not so much time. I'm not going to explain, but all of you are young scholars and you can see that there's a huge difference between community based and community led. I saw Amu's question. I think what is very important and missing today is that all of these hydropower infrastructure that we are building, none of them actually takes into account these climate modelings. We did a study across South Asia to see that, okay, you design this infrastructure, to what extent are they resilient to climate change. If tomorrow heavy rainfall comes, what would happen? How are you going to sustain? But these kind of structures that are built, they might be very well researched, but they still miss out on a very important component of bringing climate indicators while designing these structures. So I'm going to stop here. This is overall my larger response to most of these questions that I see on the chat box.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Anamika. I know that you have to now go for a class, so I don't want to stand in your way. Yeah, so I mean, Dr. Serena, I also know that, we interrupted you when Dr. Gupta joined the meeting. So if you want to conclude, we'll have the final concluding remarks from you. Maybe you can also reflect on the questions that, especially about economic growth and also hydropower infrastructure development, which is a big factor also in Southeast Asia, if you have any remarks on that. And also one of the questions which I found interesting was the role of youth in disaster risk reduction. So I was wondering, maybe you can also, talk about it a little bit if you have, any reflections on that from a Southeast Asian perspective. Thanks.
I think in 2 minutes, because the time is over. Very quickly, hydropower is not renewable energy, and it needs to take into account the destruction and displacement that occurs in its construction. It's always taken as, oh, we have renewable energy, we're using hydropower. No, it doesn't work that way. And all of the damage is not calculated, in these assumptions. So that's one for hydropower. So many things wrong with it, not taking into account, yes, as was mentioned earlier, all of the climate modeling as well. I think as a takeaway in response to all of these questions and the damage, I think we need to strengthen what we do by expanding our networks to include NGOs, civil society organizations, who then are in touch with local community. It needs to be community-led, not community-based. We need to recognize local knowledge. We need to break these hierarchies, which is actually my mission here out with the fishermen, to show that local knowledge is important and vital and valid, because of their in situ experiential, generational understandings of sea, sky, weather, and changes that they are on the front lines of, not just fishermen, but farmers, coastal communities, highland communities, indigenous communities. There is a vast mountain of knowledge that we are not tapping because we only respect knowledge coming from people who can write academically, speak the way we do, and this is not right, because we are not in situ, we are not there where the impacts are happening. This knowledge is complementary, it is traditional science, it is local science. And this is complementary to the modeling, to the technology, to all of these things that we can do, but actually it is based on local knowledge, local input. That knowledge is just not acknowledged. And this is knowledge colonization, and my pet peeve. So I can go on forever, but we are over time. So really that's the biggest takeaway that I hope people take from this. Thank you again for having me. It's been very interesting. And yeah, it's more than just tying yourselves to trees. There's a whole lot of institutional stuff that we can't change. But we need to do things and do things quickly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Serena, Dr. Anamika, Dr. Gupta, who joined us very briefly earlier on. So yeah, thank you for this wonderful discussion. I think we've touched upon a lot of issues. Of course, we can go on and on because these are like very critical issues in how we are shaping whether it's ASEAN or Southeast Asia, South Asia, regional cooperation, knowledge, science policy interface, something that also was touched upon, multi-level stakeholder engagement, and so many things that was touched upon. Thank you so much for this discussion, and I think since we are over time, I'll let Marshalin take over and take us through the concluding remarks. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you to all our distinguished speakers for such an interesting and engaging session and for being here to share your valuable insights with us. Sorry, we went a little over time. So on behalf of Asian Confluence, I also thank everyone who joined and contributed questions and reflections. We hope the ideas shared today will support continued dialogue and stronger cooperation between ASEAN and India. So the recorded sessions will always be available on our YouTube channel in case if you want to go back to it. So thank you once again for being a part of this session. We wish you all a wonderful and pleasant day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.